going to meet now and with whom we're going to talk for a little while has been elected to the 1990 Women's Hall of Fame in Marin County here in our area in California. Her name is Mrs. Elizabeth Smith Gatov, and she certainly is well deserving of this award. First of all, congratulations.
Thank you very
Libby.
much, Wanda.
And your friends call you Libby, so
yes.
We'll kind of do a few things around here, if you don't mind. Now, Mrs. Smith took various paths to the spot where she is today. Let's start at the beginning, Libby. Where were you born? Tell me about your family, your mother and your father, and what began life for you.
Well, I was born in a suburb of Montreal, and
in Canada.
In Canada. Mm-hmm. My parents had both been born Americans but became Canadians, and I went to school there until I was about 14. And by this time, our parents, there were 4 of us in my generation, felt we weren't learning enough about the United States. So the answer to that was to send us all to this country to boarding school, which happened. And I and 2 of my brothers stayed and became Americans. One went back to Canada and remains still a Canadian. I was entranced by the freedom that we had in school here compared to the rather rigid British background that I'd been growing up in. So I happily adapted.
What school did you go to?
I went to Dobbs Ferry, which is just outside of New York, about 45 minutes on the train. It was to a college preparatory school. And then I went from there to Smith. And then I got married in the middle of my junior year. And then about 4 years later, found myself in Ann Arbor, where my then husband was going to law school. And I went on a picnic, as I recall well, at which a lot of professors were present. And one of them said, "Why don't you go back to school?" Mm-hmm. I don't know why. I never asked myself that question, but anyway, I did. And got a degree at Michigan in Far Eastern Civilizations.
Okay, now you went to Smith, leaving your mother and father. Had your mother had a great influence on you, as mothers do, of course, but can you remember anything that she said to you once that pointed you in a direction that you later went?
No, really the direction that I got from both my parents was very similar. Just because you're a girl does not entitle you to any special privileges or exemptions or anything of the sort. In other words, we expect the same of you that we expect of your brothers. And that was made pretty clear.
And conversely, they gave you the impression that you could do the same things your brothers did.
I could do anything. And they not only put no prohibitions on, they just encouraged me to do whatever, but just keep doing.
Yeah, good. That sounds like a good idea from.
Well, I remember being offered the choice of making my debut or going to college. Well, that was easy. I mean, I had no interest in being a debutante, and I didn't want to go to college.
So you went to college, went to Smith.
I'd met a man named Louis Ledoux outside of New York, who was head of the Japan Society. In fact, I think he founded it. He'd been to Japan many times and had an incredible collection of total fireproof wing built on his house, which housed his Japanese collection, which included robes, and it was fabulous. And I was impressed mightily and aware that I knew absolutely nothing about the Far East, nothing. It was never mentioned in any courses I'd ever taken. So when I went to college, it seemed to me obvious that here was an area that Michigan offered a lot of courses in. My chance, so I took it. Yeah, and loved it.
Did you become involved in civic things at that time?
Oh, things like Red Cross, things of that sort that were sort of war-related. I remember Hamilton Air Force Base in those days had a huge hospital installation where they flew wounded in from the Pacific. And so I did a lot of work there. which was connected with the Red Cross, mostly just plugging in telephones so the men could make phone calls and bringing them milkshakes by the gallon, practically. It was simple, but it was work that was appreciated and needed to be done.
Part of the war
Part of the war
at
effort,
that
really,
time,
yeah. Simple sort of way.
We hear a lot about, you see, women did that. Women are very important during the war, and women went to work during the war in factories, manufacturing the implements of war, if you will, and all that. And then when the war was over, what happened? Did you find a repression came along? You know, I mean, that you were not able to do?
I opened a dress shop in Kentfield, which I later sold, and then see what happened next. I'm a little fuzzy about it, but I never had a problem with finding something to do. Then I went to work on the Independent Journal.
Yes.
And enjoyed that very much, and left that to go into something called the Coro Foundation.
You say you went to the Independent Journal, and you worked there as...
I became feature editor there and enjoyed it hugely.
Yeah.
I often wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed.
Yeah. Yeah, you probably an editor or publisher of something.
I liked it very much. And I'll never forget one little bit of it. The only job that was open the time I went to see the publisher was assistant to the society editor, which was the last thing I had in mind. But I said I'd take it if he'd give me the first job in the editorial side when it opened up. And she became sick after about 2 weeks. And I had learned how to count for headlines, a few little basic things like that. But otherwise, and in those days, the society pages were about 2.5 full pages.
Yes, it was a lot of it.
It was a lot.
Yeah.
And I hadn't the faintest idea what to do. And in those days, the paper was small enough so that the shop was on the same floor as the editorial staff. So I went into the shop and said, in effect, you know, you guys help me. I don't know what I'm doing. And they were wonderful, just wonderful. And I was so amazed when the pages came out looking fine.
And with your name there, maybe.
And with my name there. And no typos. It was just miraculous to me.
Then you got involved in politics just about
yes,
that
in
time?
1948, which was just after that. I knew Roger Kent slightly. We carpooled. And I picked up the paper and saw that he was running for Congress. So I telephoned, and his wife Alice said, well, I was just about to call you to see if you could give us a hand in this. I knew nothing about politics, but nor did he, and nor did anybody else that came into it.
Why was he running, and why did you feel this important if you knew nothing about it and hadn't ever...
Well, I knew him, and I thought that he was a fine person and would make a contribution.
Right.
And I knew I was a Democrat, and the paper said he was a Democrat. So with that slender information, seemed enough for me, and they lived very nearby, so it was very simple. And we just sort of got started.
Again, that was another start, and you tried it, and you went...
And liked it.
Yes, and you, when I first met you, you were the Democratic Party, as far as I was concerned. You and Roger Kent, and Alan Cranston, and a few people like that.
Exactly. There were about 10 or 15 of us who sort of came into the thing at the same time. And the California Democratic Council was being formed. And Cranston was the founder of that, and the one who really made it go.
Right.
So we all participated and thought politics was just great fun.
Recently in California, here as of the beginning of 1991, we know about Dianne Feinstein running for governor last year and almost winning, and Barbara Boxer is planning to run for the Senate, and these are people you certainly knew and watched. How about women in politics now?
I'm thrilled that things Well, things are both opening up and women are moving in. I mean, the two things are going together. And I'm just delighted to see it happen. People used to make comments to me about the fact that there weren't more women in politics, but actually you have to be in a very special position to be able to do it.
What kind of position?
Well, you have to have grown children who are away. I mean, you have to no longer feel that you're home base.
Because it takes a lot of energy and time.
Tremendous.
Yes.
And you have to have a compliant, at least, husband, if you have a husband, who's willing to go along with this caper, if you choose to look at it that way. And I think it takes a very special kind of man to be able to put up with the intrusions and the diversions that naturally this kind of activity requires of a woman.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm trying to think of other women who were around at the time that you were very active in the Democratic Party.
Well, Ellie Heller, whose name you probably remember.
Yes.
She preceded me, and my personal role model was Helen Gahagan Douglas,
right,
who ran for the Senate in 1950.
Tell us a little bit about her.
Well, I didn't know an awful lot about her, but I remember when she came to Marin, and I, for some reason, was among the 2 or 3 people who picked her up. She was flown in by helicopter next to the courthouse, the old courthouse in San Rafael. And we picked her up and took her to whatever she was going to talk at. I was enormously impressed. She had a wonderful manner, and I was just sick about what Nixon did to her.
Yes, tell us, I mean, she had a very...
He tagged her the Pink Lady, something like that.
This was during the time of
1950.
the Red Scare.
Yes, it was.
Right.
And what hadn't been scared up, he succeeded in scaring up, and really painted her as a menace. And the fact that she was a woman didn't help any, because if she fought back on the same plane that he was attacking her, I think she felt that she would be destroying the image that she wanted to create.
Right. Then there was another woman in the Democratic structure that impressed you, and that was Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, indeed.
Tell us about her and her influence on you, or the role. Was she a role model?
Huh? She was up there so high in my panoply that it's hard to even give it a name. And I remember having the tremendous pleasure of picking her up at the Fairmont and taking her to whatever I was taking her to. And she, as I've learned since I've met some other really, in my book, great people, was a very simple-mannered woman. It was very easy to talk to her. She didn't intimidate you. I mean, I was already intimidated at the prospect of meeting her.
Yes.
But as soon as I did, she sort of didn't figuratively, literally pat me on the head and say, calm down, cool it, but that was the effect that she had on me.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy. You were very active in the Democratic Party at the time he was nominated for the presidency.
Yes. I was what they call Democratic National Committee woman. I forget how many they have now, but in my day they had a woman and a man from each state. And by tradition, really, the woman came from Northern California and the man came from Southern California. That had been the way it was for some 20 years.
And so you were
And that entitled me to go back to Washington frequently for meetings. And then I got on the executive committee, and that entitled me to help plan conventions, all of which I found very, very interesting. I just found the whole business of politics fascinating.
And that convention was in Los Angeles.
Right. The one that nominated Kennedy.
The one that nominated John Kennedy. Were you a part of nominating him? Were you instrumental in that?
Only to the extent that I was able to persuade members of the California delegation, which even in those days was huge by relative standards.
Yes.
Adlai Stevenson, who had really pulled out, was persuaded, I think he felt later against his better judgment, to try to get back in. And that was very painful because I'd been very
You mean he
attached to
pulled
it.
out of running for president?
Yes, he had. He'd said he wasn't going to run. It seemed as though the whole field was wide open. And then he was persuaded about in early May to let his name be talked about. And, well, I remember getting a very sad, for me, phone call from him, you know, suggesting that I not support Kennedy, but
But you were already...
I was already there, and I couldn't go back on my commitment. And besides, I didn't want to. I thought, you know, twice defeated is enough. There was no way things had changed enough, in my view, so that he could possibly
Because he had run twice
He'd run
already.
twice and been defeated.
Yes. And Mrs. Roosevelt backed
Yes, she
Mr.
did.
Kennedy at that time. Okay, now, where were you when you heard he was elected? We were, well,
I was
not nominated, of course, you were there, but you were here. And tell me, I mean, I'd like to know a little bit about your impression of him, what it might have meant if he had
my initial impression of him was of enormous vitality, just tremendous vitality. And far more than anybody I had ever encountered in politics.
And presence.
And presence. So,
yes.
Yes, he was a very commanding person without intimidating people at all. But he, because of his back problems, he was very erect. His carriage was absolutely beautiful. And once I saw the back equipment that he wore on a train, he had changed his shirt, and anyway, he was trying to button it and poke it down in the back, and he poked it inside this brace so that you could see the brace. Oh, it was a brutal-looking thing.
Yeah, and
Awful.
people didn't realize
No,
that.
they didn't realize. He was in pain most of the time.
Yeah. Now, he obviously was impressed by you, though, because once he was elected to be President of the United States in 1960, and went back to Washington, was inaugurated and everything like that, he phoned you and asked you to be Treasurer of the United States.
Well, that came about, as I understand it, because Pat Brown, who was then governor, and Claire Engel, who was then our Democratic senator, and some others were back there meeting with Kennedy, and they had a list with them of people that they would like him to consider for an appointment, Californians. And apparently I was on the list. And as I heard the tale later, he didn't respond much until they got down to me. And then he was reported to have said, well, that's a hell of a good idea. And
why do you think? Did you ever find, was it because he'd known you and your great work? Was it because you were a woman?
I think it's because I was a woman.
A little bit of both, maybe.
Yeah, and I think even then, there were very few spots, up to that time anyway, in the federal establishment, that were really open to women in those days. And Treasurer was one.
Yeah.
And
so
I was just lucky.
You were the only woman.
Well, at that point.
Yeah.
At that time, the Treasurer's office was sort of middle-level management, I guess.
Yeah.
But I know I was the first woman, and I think I held the highest on the government chart.
I'm sure you
spot. But
well, we'll say you did, because
well,
I'm sure you did. But what was it like to be the only woman in that?
Well, my office there had been other women treasurers. So everybody was quite relaxed about it who worked in the treasurer's office.
You didn't have to, quote, pioneer
I
that
didn't
particular
at
thing.
all.
But you could have done
And,
that. You had an idea while you were treasurer to print different denominations of bills in colors. Whatever happened to that? It sounds like a good idea.
Well, I didn't get anywhere with it because, well, it took a lot of people okaying it and so forth, and it hadn't yet gotten to the White House by the time I finally left to come home and get married. But Claire Engel picked it up and tried to go someplace with it and couldn't. Strangely, the opposition to it was mostly from small towns in the interior part of the country. I got a lot of mail, an enormous amount of mail, that you could just put into two piles, pro and con. And the pros were New York Times,
Yes.
papers like of that stature and constituency. And then there were all these innumerable small papers that just proliferate like pansies practically through the country. And I would get letters saying, you know, why don't you just decorate your office and leave the money alone?
Decorate, and that's interesting because that was. Do you think if a man had suggested that idea, it would have been a different reaction?
Possibly, quite possibly.
Somebody would have said, "Hey, that's efficient." Huh?
We're the only major country that doesn't do it.
Have you heard of it being attempted again?
No, nobody's. Apparently, everybody was scared after my experience. Nobody's mentioned it since.
I'll be darned. You were married for some time before Mr. Gatov died, and then you did something else. You wrote a book.
Oh, Widows in the Dark. I guess that I was as no more, no less incompetent about money than most women whose husbands have basically done it all. But I didn't make a fuss about the fact that I didn't know anything about it. It was working very nicely.
Sure.
But then I found that after he died that I had to make some decisions. I had to do something.
You've been in many, many groups, but Planned Parenthood was a special interest of yours.
Well, it was.
And families, but let's talk about Planned Parenthood.
Well, Planned Parenthood was particularly because when I was in college, pardon me, a friend of mine had become pregnant. And
she wasn't married,
she wasn't
I guess.
married.
Yeah.
She was just like all the rest of us, single student. And we tried and tried to find a doctor to do an abortion. And we couldn't find one.
Yeah.
And she finally drowned herself in the
Committed suicide.
lake, committed suicide, which was on the lake, which was on the campus. And it made a deep impression on me that this was, this was dreadful.
A waste.
Shouldn't be that way. So while I was in Washington, I began finding out about Planned Parenthood and saying to myself, well, when I get out of this situation, so I don't want to mix the two, I'm certainly going to explore getting into Planned Parenthood. It sounds like something I'd like. So I did.
And you didn't just dabble in it, though. You became very active in Marin County and in Washington.
And yes. And the reason they're still occasionally saying thank you for something is that I kept insisting that they get involved in politics.
Okay, so you've got these two together.
Well, if they're going to accept federal money, you'd better be a presence on the federal scene, it seemed to me. But they were scared to death of politics because they were afraid they'd lose their tax exemption. Well, they didn't. To be brief about it, they didn't lose their tax exemption, and they did get into politics.
Well, when you say into politics, you're talking about now lobbying with legislators to get things passed?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Exactly.
Are you still working in that field? Because it's a very volatile field right now in 19...
I presume it is. No, I got out of it perhaps 10 years ago, I guess.
What would you say right now to a young woman who came to you saying, here I am, I'm just getting out of college, I'm not quite sure what I want to do? This is a big, broad question, Libby, but you have indicated to me and to all of us who are meeting with you right now that you try things out, and if it fits, you'll know, and you carry on. Is it that simple?
The easiest way is to take a job that is open.
Any job. Like you took a secondary job at the IJ in order to move ahead.
To move ahead.
Don't steal you.
I felt quite comfortable about being the assistant society editor because I believed Roy Brown when he said that he would move me over, and he did.
You have to have faith.
Yes, you have to size up the people you're dealing with and know whether you think you can trust them. But I don't know any other way than to just take an opportunity when it is there, if you think there's any possibility that it's going to take you the way you want to go.
Do you feel encouraged about the position of women today? You know, for a while, women are going to make this great big difference, and then it seems to have kind of slacked off a little bit. What do you think?
Well, I think...
Or is that too... Are women... It's, when you say the women, is that too big a group?
It is to me.
Is it?
Oh, yes. I don't think you can generalize about what women are going to believe any more than you can generalize about men. They're individual, they're impressed by different things, they're affected by different things, and I don't think organizing women is an easy thing to do, to get them all
to do the same
thing. So there's infinite variety, and I'm disappointed that there aren't more women running for political office.
What do you think is, if you were to list up all the things you've done, what would be the biggest achievement you've done? What's the thing you're proudest of in your life, Libby Gatov?
Oh, I think Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. I was fortunate, I think, in getting involved in it just as it was becoming somewhat respectable, so that it was a subject that you could talk about. It was
with the windows open, you know, and out in the front of people.
And it just happened that I got involved at the same time that they began to spread their wings. Mm-hmm. And I think it's had an enormous effect worldwide.
It sure has. Then that's the thing that...
That's the thing that...
That would be it.
To me, that was the most...
And of course, you mentioned your family a time or two. We didn't go too much into it. You have 2 children?
Yes.
2 children.
They're 9 years apart.
Yeah.
And had different fathers. And so my daughter is 50-something or other, 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. And my son is in his 40s.
Mm-hmm. And so they're there, too, in your list of achievements. Yeah, I know family's been important to you.
Yes.
This has been wonderful to talk with you.
Well, I've enjoyed it, Wanda. Thank you.